What did you make of the questions they asked, the answers they received in return, and how likely they ultimately are to make a decision on this that favors Donald Trump?
Well, I was struck by how there didn't seem to be a clear path toward a majority on any one way to resolve this case. We heard a lot of concern about the consequences of ruling that a president can be criminally prosecuted for official acts taken while in office. That was articulated in particular by Justices Alito and Gorsuch. Wouldn't this have a chilling effect on a president who would be chilled while in office and who would be susceptible to prosecution by political enemies when he left office? What would be the consequence of a ruling that a president could be prosecuted, right, from that point of view? And then you had the other concern that a contrary ruling holding that a president could not be prosecuted for official acts, right? What would that say in terms of creating the possibility that somebody would be absolutely above the law, even once they left the office of the presidency, and could just essentially commit acts without any consequence that were criminal, using the highest office in the land, the most powerful office in the world, to commit crimes. So you had those two competing concerns, and which of those is a greater concern for the majority of the court may frame how it comes out in this case.
Well, I'm confused, Jessica, and I know that happens a lot, but when you look at the history here, in 2020, it's not that long ago, the court unanimously rejected Donald Trump's claims of absolute immunity. So what's changed?
Well, what they rejected in the case involving Cy Vance, then the district attorney in New York County, his claim of absolute immunity from producing documents in response to a subpoena. And they said that subpoena could go forward. It had to be narrowly tailored, et cetera. Here they're talking about, and it related to acts before he was in office, when he was a private citizen. Here, the indictment alleges some acts that can be articulated as official acts, such as communications with Department of Justice employees, communications with state office holders, but then many other acts that are best characterized, and even Trump's attorney agreed they could be characterized as private acts, not official acts. And so it's the fact that some of the conduct in the indictment can be characterized as official acts is part of what takes this out of the realm of the prior decision involving immunity for subpoena for documents relating to private conduct.
Okay, so Jessica, we know that obviously this has major implications for the Jack Smith case brought here in Washington. It also could have implications for the documents case in Florida, the other federal case in which Donald Trump has been charged, although he was out of office, to your point on the distinction, by the time most of that alleged conduct happened. What about other election interference cases, like the state case in Georgia, for example? If there's something in this federal case that the Supreme Court ultimately decides he does have protection for, would that affect Fani Willis's case? Could it affect other cases in which he's an unindicted co-conspirator, as we've seen with Michigan and Arizona in the last 24 hours?
So if the court holds that he has immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts, and there's so much overlap between the arguably official acts in the Jack Smith case and the Atlanta case in Georgia, that I don't see how that same ruling wouldn't apply to the Georgia case. And then I'd have to look at the Arizona case where he's not charged. He's an unindicted co-conspirator. But anywhere where he actually was facing charges, if the court rules there's immunity in Jack Smith's case, then that immunity should apply in those cases as well. The Florida case brought by the special counsel is in a different category because that involves conduct after Trump left office. So in a sense, that's the bookend to the earlier case that we were discussing that involved conduct before he took office as president. The Jack Smith case in Florida involving the classified documents involves conduct after he left office. So I don't think a ruling from the court, even if it comes out in Trump's favor to a certain extent on immunity regarding today's argument, would help him in the Florida case, other than providing a basis for him to assert in a new motion that it does that the court would have to rule upon. So it would provide delay. But substantively, on the merits, it should not affect that case.
I want to ask you, Jessica, about what we heard today from Justice Alito as part of the immunity arguments. He supported Donald Trump's argument here, saying that it could be destabilizing if presidents are worried all the time that they'll be criminally prosecuted the minute they step out the door. We have to remind ourselves this is something that's going to apply to all presidents. He said that he questioned whether presidents will now fear they'll be criminally prosecuted by a bitter political opponent rather than going into a peaceful retirement, suggesting they may never leave the White House. If the court rules in Donald Trump's favor, what would keep Joe Biden from just staying in the Oval Office?
There were a number of fascinating moments in the argument today where some of the justices raised issues that hadn't been briefed, but that they said were relevant to their determination of the issues presented here. And for example, I think it was Justice Gorsuch who first raised the question of, well, could a president pardon himself for all potential crimes committed while in office on his way out the door so that he wouldn't have to fear prosecution once he left from political opponents? And Justice Alito picked up on that and said, yes, I think we need to know the answer to that question before we rule here on whether there's immunity. So there were these specters of incentives and, sort of this parade of horribles of things that presidents might engage in if they feared they might be prosecuted. And the answer that the lawyer for the Department of Justice and the Special Counsel's Office gave was essentially, we've just relied on public servants acting in good faith, that they wouldn't do these things out of concern about potentially being criminally prosecuted unfairly. And the status quo has been that there's been no immunity from criminal prosecution, and presidents have somehow managed to fulfill their duties without being unduly chilled and without trying to hold on to office once they had lost the next election. And so there was a fascinating sort of clash of worldviews. One that was articulated that was essentially sort of dystopian about presidents holding on to power and pardoning themselves in advance, and another worldview that said we've managed without anybody worrying too much about being politically prosecuted when they leave office. And so it was this clash of worldviews that was among the more fascinating parts of the argument.